of course, an attorney at law. Good evening and welcome back to the show, Gehan.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Yeah.
Right. So, Gehan, let's talk about the work of the Human Rights Commission as related to the system change that the people have demanded and desire. And of course, system change when it comes to the legal processes and institutions is not easy to do. You have to bring in reforms across the board to so many institutions. You have to change the mindsets of tens of thousands of judges, lawyers, investigators, policemen, all of them, and of course the mindset of the general public as well. So this is a process which is going to take years, but a lot of steps have already been taken, and there are many more steps to be taken. So there is some criticism that it is a slow process, too slow. Some obvious steps have not been taken, but there is quite a lot of progress as well. So let's start with the positives. And I believe last week we had some good news which came out of the Human Rights Commission and the police department. Would you like to tell us about it?
Certainly. So the commission was established back in 1997 pursuant to the Human Rights Commission Act of 1996. And one of the main features of the mandate of the Human Rights Commission is advising government on the necessary legal reforms and policy changes that are required to be compliant with the state's human rights obligations. So the commission has been in the process of advising relevant line ministries. At times it's even the president, and also institutional leadership, including the Inspector General of Police, on necessary changes that need to take place for human rights to be fulfilled in Sri Lanka.
Right. Let me just interrupt you.
Yes.
When you say the state's human rights obligations, this is not something abstract. It is the obligations of the state as laid out in our own constitution.
Absolutely.
And of course, the international conventions which our government has signed and the parliament has ratified into law. So this is part of our lives.
It's part of the legal framework that actually applies to us. So you're 100% right. The legal framework is set out primarily in our constitution, our fundamental rights chapter 3. And then also the obligations that Sri Lanka voluntarily signs up to by ratifying international human rights instruments. So the Commission's mandate uses these obligations as the primary benchmark against which we can give advice to governmental actors. Now, you mentioned last week there was a bit of a breakthrough, and I think it is important to recognize that it was a breakthrough. The Commission has been issuing various thematic guidelines and recommendations on very specific issues that we see are important in terms of the country's progress towards human rights realization. One of the things that we have been very concerned about in the recent past happens to be the deaths that we see in police custody. Now, there are lots of cases that are brought to the Human Rights Commission's attention through complaints. Just to give you a statistic, in the last 5 years, we recorded as many as 79 deaths in custody and also encounter deaths, where deaths take place in the process of a police operation, like an arrest. It's a very high number. So what we decided to do was issue a general set of guidelines and recommendations to Sri Lanka Police, mentioning the process that should be followed to A, prevent deaths, and then B, in the event of a death, what investigative procedure or what process should be followed to ensure accountability. And these guidelines, it's a 17-18 page document, was sent to Sri Lanka Police, namely the Inspector General of Police, in the hope that they will take it seriously and adopt them. Alongside these guidelines, we also have been very concerned about continued threats and intimidation targeting human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, civil society activists that are actually working on human rights issues have been facing intimidation and threats from law enforcement. And that's been a very serious problem and brought again to the attention of the Commission through complaints and through our various networks with these actors. Pursuant to that, we decided to issue a set of general guidelines and recommendations on the protection of human rights defenders. And that was launched last year. Again, the hope was that these guidelines will be taken seriously by law enforcement officials. A couple of weeks ago, it was a very welcome, pleasant surprise, I would say, where the IGP decided to issue these guidelines as internal circulars amongst his various divisions and various police stations. So now these guidelines have been promoted officially by the head of that department, which is a very important step because it recognizes that these guidelines are important and it takes some level of responsibility in actually abiding by these guidelines. And then we had the IGP actually participate in a panel discussion on the guidelines on custodial deaths and encounter deaths last week. This was in commemoration of the International Day that is dedicated to victims of torture. So again, in terms of the optics, in terms of signaling to the public commitment and institutional commitment, we saw this as a very important step. Apart from those two guidelines, we also had an internal circular issued on the mandate of the Commission and the powers of the Commission, instructing police officers to cooperate with the police, and also a very important set of guidelines on the recognition of transgender persons. So these 4 guidelines were actually issued as internal circulars by the IGP, which I believe is unprecedented and something that should be welcome. But now the next phase is the actual implementation and enforcement of these guidelines.
Right, but the very fact that the IGP sent out these guidelines means that the entire police force is now aware of these guidelines, which are the procedures. So for example, there cannot be any, any situation where the Human Rights Commission officials try to enter particular premises and they are turned away illegally, arbitrarily by police who say, we don't know about this. Because now they do know. They do know that the Human Rights Commission has the duty of access to these locations.
Absolutely. So the hope is that there will be a mainstreaming of these norms. So these ultimately boil down to norms and values that the institution should be following in order to reform. You mainstream these norms by having internal circulars articulating these norms spread across the institution. Now this, as you said, system change is not easy. It has to happen incrementally over time, but we believe that this is an important step in the right direction. What is really the major challenge, I think, and we'll speak a little bit about this this evening, hopefully, is accountability. How do we really make sure that while institutions are reforming, we are also holding institutions and the actors within institutions accountable for past wrongdoings? Because if we don't have accountability, what we have instead is impunity. And you can't really do system change when there's impunity.
Well, but the level of impunity should reduce when you have these strict guidelines and rules in place. For example, I think was it last year where we had some refugees from Myanmar who washed ashore at somewhere off the east coast, and they were refugees. So internationally, they are protected, but they were taken to a camp, and then I believe when your officials tried to access them, initially that access was denied. But now no one can say, oh, we didn't know that the Human Rights Commission needs to have access.
Absolutely.
I mean, after all, it is a commission. It needs, it has those powers, and it's not a commission which came about, last week. It's been there for a good 30 years now.
Absolutely.
So this, what needs to be done is, if there are transgressions, then those officials need to be taken to task.
I think you're absolutely right, and the reason that I say accountability is so important is that we have a poor experience, and we've spoken a little bit about the positives. The real negative I see is the lack of a strong institution that is tasked with delivering accountability. And I'll give you one good example. We have had an act that criminalizes torture since 1994. When Sri Lanka ratified the Convention Against Torture, one of the first things we did was we brought in an Act of Parliament that brought a new offence of torture into our legal system. Now, that act has been there for 31 years. We have had a special investigative unit established to investigate allegations of torture when there's sufficient reasonable suspicion, I would say, that that torture had actually taken place. So often these cases are launched when the Supreme Court of the country, exercising its fundamental rights jurisdiction, finds a particular officer responsible for torture. Then what it often does is it then recommends that the Attorney General launch legal proceedings under the Torture Act, and the High Court will then see whether criminal offence has been committed. The problem there is that the actual investigation into the alleged offence from that point onwards is conducted by the police. And the startling reality is, in 31 years, we've had only around 100, I think one recent study put the number at 115 cases of torture, from which we have secured only 6 convictions, according to that study. That's an appalling rate of conviction when we have this act and we know that torture is a real problem in Sri Lanka.
I mean, it's rampant.
It's rampant. The Human Rights Commission received 737 complaints relating to torture just in 2024.
And these are just complaints where, I would guess that there's 10 times the number of torture cases.
Probably the tip of the iceberg, because these are only people who are willing to come and make complaints to the Human Rights Commission. So to tell the public that while we have this act, while we have the normative framework in place, we have only been able to secure 6 convictions, that's a serious problem.
But then your point was that the investigation is being done by the police themselves.
That's right.
It's ridiculous. I mean, in Sinhala you say, Horage ammagin pena hua, which is basically asking the mother of the thief whether he stole something. So that's ridiculous.
Structural conflict of interest. Many countries, including South Africa, Canada, the United Kingdom, they all have mechanisms to investigate these types of serious crimes that sit outside the regular police force, outside the hierarchy. That's the only way you deliver on accountability. And even Sri Lanka has its mechanism when it comes to bribery and corruption.
So,
right?
This is the appalling situation. If you accuse a policeman of bribery, then it is investigated by the Bribery Commission.
That's right.
Which is not answerable to the IGP, and therefore is independent. But if you accuse a police officer of torture, it is the police which investigate, and they will cover up. They're part of the entire cover-up mechanism. I mean, that's the way it is. It's human nature. It is this community of...
there are good police officers, but you can't depend on individual police officers to deliver accountability when the system has a fundamental problem, a conflict of interest. And you're absolutely right. If we can find an institution with investigative and prosecutorial powers to look into allegations of bribery and corruption, and Siebok is making significant progress, why can't we do the same for serious crimes, including torture, custodial deaths, enforced disappearance? These are crimes that the police, if accused, should not be tasked with investigating, because that you're asking for trouble, and the statistics on torture in the last 31 years demonstrates this problem very clearly.
Now, Gehan, the manner in which the police deal with accusations against it or custodial deaths. Let's take custodial deaths. When a suspect, who is a person, when he or she dies in custody, the immediate reaction is cover it up. No police officer, no policeman should be held responsible or go to jail. So the entire police station will probably get involved in the cover-up because they knew the suspect is being tortured. I mean, this doesn't happen, there's no secret soundproof cell in each police station. It is, it's right there. It's either in the OIC's room or it's in the cell, or the person is taken out and beaten up at the back of the police station. So the entire police station knows it. This is their modus operandi, their standard operating procedure. So, it's not that they set out to kill a suspect. What often happens is they go overboard. The person may actually have a heart condition. They don't know that. They go and beat him up. He has a heart attack and dies. Then they say he had a heart attack and died. But what caused it? So this whole methodology of the cover-up needs to be dismantled. Where if somebody dies in custody, first of all, they should stop issuing media releases saying a suspect died. It's not a suspect who died, it was a person who died, because you're dehumanizing, right? So they need to start right from there, and they need to remove all those police officers from the vicinity so that they can't tamper with what is now a crime scene.
That's right. Yeah.
So there has to be a proper process, because if someone dies, if there's a murder, then that's a crime scene. If it's out on the road or in a house, it's a crime scene. But here you have the perpetrators who are freely gathering around.
And the guidelines that we issued actually have sections dedicated to the process that should be followed when a death actually takes place. And one of the principles that we call for is that the investigation should be by independent committee. Now, we are saying independent committee because the law at the moment does not provide for the mechanism that I'm talking about, the mechanism that is totally independent of the regular police hierarchy. That's the gold standard that we should be aspiring to, and that may require a new law that sets up a new institution similar to CIABOC. But at least for the moment, the investigation, whenever it's a serious crime like a custodial death, should be by a committee that has nothing to do with those who are accused of the crime. So that's a principle we can start with immediately. And then it needs to be given full fruition and full effect by a new law that sets up a new institution.
Now, again, when a person is brought in, there is no proper process. He's just thrown into the cell. He is a subhuman now, because the police believe that he had something to do with a crime, or that one of his relatives committed the crime. This is a very strange country where we arrest everyone, including the family dog, right? If the police can't find the suspect, everybody else is taken in, which is quite ridiculous. But once people are brought in, there's no proper process. For example, I would say half the population in this country has some kind of medical condition. We have high levels of diabetes, of pressure, and so on. Alcoholism, you name it, we've got all these conditions, and we are not a fit and healthy population. I don't know how we are globally, but we are just not. Our people don't exercise regularly. Our diet is crap. Okay, I'm sorry to say. So we're not healthy. So you might have a heart condition. So shouldn't the police have some kind of? I mean, it could be even a form, right? Where you have to sign saying, "I don't have a heart condition. I don't."
Absolutely.
There has to be.
So the guidelines, as I said before, we focus on accountability if a death has taken place. But the other section of the guidelines that focuses on preventative measures through following process. And some of the things you're mentioning, like actually following due process when someone is taken into custody, ensuring that his health conditions, any kind of vulnerability is known prior to interrogation, making sure he has access to legal counsel. A lot of these incidents take place while going on these visits to find so-called weapons somewhere. And some of these operations are conducted at night. That should not be the norm. It should be only in extremely exceptional circumstances with the authority of the, the highest authority within the police hierarchy for such an operation to be conducted. It cannot be the norm, because a lot of these things happen because the opportunity is presented for wrongdoing. And one of the things that the guidelines hope to achieve is to narrow the scope for such opportunities by ensuring that procedure is followed. And if the IGP is willing to issue these guidelines as an internal circular, that means every police station in this country are bound by these guidelines and should be following it. And if the commission gets complaints, so now we spoke a little bit about the advisory sort of mandate of the commission. The core mandate is to inquire into complaints brought to us by the public, right? By victims of human rights. That's the core mandate, and we have something close to 13,000 complaints that we're currently trying to process with a very small staff. But the point is, when we issue these guidelines and we do get a complaint related to arrest and detention or torture or even custodial death, we will be enforcing these guidelines when we determine as to whether a fundamental rights violation has taken place in the context of that complaint. And we will be reminding the IGP, we will be reminding the relevant officers that the guidelines have also been violated in the process of violating that complainant's fundamental rights.
So, Gehan, you said 13,000 complaints.
Yes.
Most of them are against whom? Police officers?
No, I wouldn't say that.
Are there complaints?
It's a combination. It's a combination of many different types of complaints. Our mandate is very broad, so every complaint has to allege a violation of fundamental rights, but that could range from a state institution not transferring someone when they are owed a transfer, to custodial death.
Yes.
Right? There's a rather wide range, and a lot of the cases we get are administrative cases. So there's a real need to also find ways in which people that have specific type of administrative grievances have alternative remedies to pursue before coming to the commission. So the commission can really focus on the cases that deal with personal liberty, because those are the types of cases that I believe the commission has to prioritize. And we are prioritizing it, because when someone is at risk of being tortured, that is the highest priority, versus someone, which I do think for that person it's an important issue, but still in the greater scheme of things, when someone hasn't got their transfer or hasn't received a promotion, that's the kind of case that we will consider, but not at the same level of intensity and priority that we will give a personal liberty case.
Absolutely. And I think you also, the Commission has also broached the topic of CCTVs in police stations, which I believe the Indian Supreme Court a few years ago has mandated that every police station in India needs to have CCTV. It's still being implemented. It's not easy to do. It takes a lot of resources and all that. But in Sri Lanka, it should be a lot simpler. And
so two things that are important
there?
It's very important that every police station has a designated space or location where interrogations are conducted. And that space should have CCTV. So it's very simple. In order to minimize the scope for abuse and torture during an interrogation, you first have to say no interrogation can take place outside this space. If you want to have an interrogation, it has to be in this space. Any interrogation outside is prohibited. That's the first step. The second step is that all interrogations should be monitored. So it can be reviewed in the event of some misconduct. And then, of course, when you have CCTV cameras installed, that acts as a deterrent. This is how it's done in a lot of countries. And we can use technology, again, to minimize the scope for abuse. And while we work on changing hearts and minds and changing institutional cultures and all of that is fine, but at the same time, we have to have deterrents that are instituted through appropriate technology. I mean, having body cameras would be the next milestone, but we don't have the kind of resources to do that at the moment.
But that's the ultimate.
That would be the ultimate. Yes. But then, that's not sufficient. You have body cameras in places like the United States of America where the police commit crimes against victims on a regular basis, right?
Knowing very well that they are themselves recording their own crime.
Absolutely. And then suddenly sometimes these body cameras are mysteriously switched off, or the footage goes missing. So I am not saying that any of these things guarantee institutional change. This is a multi-pronged approach, and even some of the most so-called sophisticated democracies out there have serious problems with police brutality and violence. And America is the classic example there. However, we need to use technology to reduce the scope, and I think CCTV cameras being installed is one step in the right direction, in the hope that we will continue to gain resources and continue to think of innovative ways in which we can deal with this problem.
Excellent. This is indeed a fascinating discussion, and I have many more questions. But we need to take a short commercial break right now. I am in conversation with Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, one of the commissioners of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Sirasa Dancing Star. The preliminary round selection test will be held on July 1st at 9 a.m. at YMBA Hall, Kandy. July 2nd at 9 a.m. at the Anuradhapura Municipal Council No. 2 Community Hall. July 3rd at 9 a.m. at the Veerasingham Hall, Jaffna. If you are an excellent dancer, come to the nearest venue with your dance group and showcase your talent.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am in conversation with Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, attorney at law and one of the commissioners of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Gehan, let's talk a little bit about the Bribery Commission, which seems to be in the thick of things, in the news. It's marvelous what they're doing. They seem to be arresting high-powered individuals as well as others, of course. They seem to be getting a lot more complaints. Wonderful. A lot of decisive action. What's brought about this change?
I think if there is political commitment to permit institutions to do their job without interference, you will find that a lot of institutions begin to deliver. We see this with the judiciary. With the judiciary is permitted the space to act independently without political interference, we see the judiciary deliver marvelous results. And Sri Lanka, we have had judgments that have been outstanding. The moment there's political interference, the institution begins to face that pressure. And that is an interference with the independence of those institutions. Similarly, I would say the Human Rights Commission has not encountered interference, at least during my tenure in the last 2 years. And I think the rest of the commissioners will also agree with me. We have not faced any interference, not from this government, not from the government prior to it. And that has really provided the space for the commission to do its job. And we try our best with the limited resources we have to do our job. And sometimes that job entails being critical of the government. And we have been able to be critical of the government, and we haven't really felt like that criticism has attracted undue interference. I imagine that the Searbox success can also be attributed to that same factor. It does have the right expertise, it has the right powers. Like I mentioned before, it has the ability to investigate and prosecute through its own officers without dependence on law enforcement officials. So then if, for example, a police officer is accused of bribery or corruption, the officers investigating that crime are not reporting to the regular hierarchy of the police. So that enables it to actually do its job. But the reason it is able to do its job so effectively, I believe, is because there's a climate right now, a political climate right now, that is somehow giving the space to institutional actors to do their job. The moment you try to choreograph this too much, the moment you start trying to drive accountability through political means, you will see the institutions also crumbling. So I hope that this can be sustained.
Excellent. Now, I do want to ask you about reform of laws, but first, let me ask you about this investigation of mass graves.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to simplify this. We have mass graves all over the country. It's not something in the north and east. It's all over the country, and such mass graves have been discovered for decades. I was there at Surya Kanda. That was back in 1994, and of course we have mass graves being discovered even this year, last year, and so on. Now, the issue we seem to be having is we as a people, as a nation, we are unsure of how to deal with this. There are, of course, there's a lot of baggage surrounding these. Why were they killed? What were the political issues? Were they part of an organization which was, so-called terrorists and so on, whether it's in the north or the south? And there are many issues. But let me simplify this. If a man is killed on the street and his body is dumped somewhere, his body is discovered, there is a process. You call the police, you call, then the police have a process. The JMO comes into it, the coroner, the magistrates, there's a process.
That's right.
But if you discover 50 bodies which have been there for, could be a year, could be 10 years, then we don't seem to have a process. And that's a failing. Because it shouldn't be about, oh, it's these people buried here and it was these people who committed that crime. There should be a proper process. And we see this in other countries. Right now in Syria, where the Assad regime was overthrown, we have international teams which are helping to investigate. So I'm not saying we need international teams here. I'm saying we need a local process. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think you're right to point out to the fact that this should be much simpler than it is becoming. I think we are trying to portray a complexity that may not be necessarily there. When you find bodies in a mass grave, the chances are that a crime has been committed. Unless you're able to trace it to some pandemic event back in history where people were buried en masse because of some disease, I can only think of that as an alternative explanation, but we are not saying that. This is really evidence of a crime. So when there is a crime, there must be clarity of thought and a simple reality that we must get to the bottom of this crime. And if we want to get to the bottom of the crime, we must pursue the truth. If we want to pursue the truth, we must have a process that can deliver us that truth. And really the simple fact is, if there is an independent process that is really focused on achieving that goal, truth, and we really want to enable this process to go forward, I believe everything else begins to fall in line. So the object really should be to get to the bottom of it rather than to do anything else like manage the international community or try to divert attention away from this issue to other issues. Any kind of object to manage this, you're going to have a lot of complexity. But if the object is to discover the truth, the clarity of thought is there, and then you ensure that the investigators are given full license and resources and expertise to do their job without political interference. Now that requires a commitment to that truth. If you have the commitment, I think the resources and expertise follow. Whether those expertise exist in Sri Lanka or whether you need to bring internationals down again, that depends on the case at hand. And I believe often we need to get international participants, international expertise to get to the bottom, because some of these investigations require certain forensic experts that we may or may not have in the country. And we have in the past had many investigations, many criminal trials have brought in international experts as experts as witnesses or experts as part of the investigations. That happens, and sometimes we send experts out to the international community. So this process,
let me interrupt you by saying we bring international experts for every other thing.
Correct.
We want a highway built, we bring the Chinese, the Koreans,
so
or the
we
Japanese.
need not see international expertise as some kind of black mark on our capabilities. We do this all the time.
I mean, it's best if we can do it ourselves.
Yes, and I think because there's such a lack of trust that has been growing over the years, because of that lack of commitment to the truth, it is understandable that victim communities want that guarantee. And the guarantee comes through international participation, right? So it's understandable that people would demand it. You can't keep pushing that away, saying, no, we have the expertise. No, we don't want international interference. For everything else, we do get international experience and expertise. If we want to draft some complicated law, we get international consultants. Sometimes we have all the expertise that we need in Sri Lanka, but we still get international consultants. If you ask a particular development agency to help you do something today, guarantee that development agency will bring down an international consultant to work on that project. That's considered the norm. So I think we shouldn't see international expertise as some kind of black mark. We should embrace it if it is required. But all of that follows from the first point. The first point being, are we committed to the truth? Are we committed to accountability or not? If we are, this should be a no-brainer.
But even, does it, I get your point that we need to be committed to it, but it's the law. You have to investigate. If you find, you're excavating something and you find a body, you can't continue to, I need to build this building here, forget about the body. No, you have to stop everything.
Absolutely. It really should be simple. Yeah, it should be simple. And the way you put it, I agree with, because it is a crime. And if we discover a body in someone's well, certainly there will be a lot of time, effort and resources put into trying to figure out what happened there, right? Now you put 50 people in that well, suddenly there's a bit of hesitation. It becomes something people are looking at each other's faces over, and there's a lack of progress. So really, you put it perfectly, this should be a simple matter, but to deliver on the truth and accountability, we need to empower those processors and give the processors the right kind of space to play out.
And again, it's about expertise. Now, we were talking about the expertise of the police, of the bribery commission, and so on. Who has expertise in this particular field in Sri Lanka? I know there are various academics, forensic scientists, and so on, but shouldn't it all come together in some form?
It certainly should. It should be something that comes together. I think one of the main priorities in a case like that is the preservation of evidence, right? And if evidence is in any way tampered with or allowed to be exposed to the elements, you can very quickly jeopardize the actual investigation. So preservation of evidence needs to be a priority, and sometimes those techniques are also techniques that either exist or they don't. And if they don't exist, you need to bring in international expertise to ensure that the evidence is preserved for the subsequent investigation and subsequent even a trial that might be required.
So now when you say preservation of evidence, I am seeing several aspects. One is you don't want a rainstorm coming in and drenching the whole place.
Absolutely.
And then everything gets messed up. You don't want the investigators using big mammoths or whatever, and when they're digging, they destroy the evidence unintentionally.
That's right.
And you also don't want parties with vested interests coming in there and destroying the evidence. So when you
fundamentally,
say,
you don't want contamination of the evidence, and you don't want to break the chain of custody, where if you do, allegation later can be made that, well, this is not what was actually found, it has got mixed up with other things, and now there's a question mark as to whether this is authentic. Right. These are the sorts of problems that we have encountered in other cases. Right. So there is a genuine fear that in this case also there will be a failure, which is why they want the victims, the civil society groups that are involved in advocating for accountability are demanding some kind of scrutiny and participation by the international community and international experts because of that experience. And whether you agree with it or not, you need to understand it. And I think it's understandable if a community goes through a bad experience for a long time, for them to want something a little different to what they've been getting all along.
Right. And right now we have several ongoing sites like this. It's not just the Chemmani site, which, by the way, dates back to 1996.
That's right.
We have Kokkuturuai, we have Mana, we have Matale, we have Suryakanda, we have one in the port of Colombo. Which doesn't seem to get much publicity. But what's going on? So actually, we need to do some soul searching as a nation, I think, and figure out. Because in the end, these are people.
Absolutely.
I mean, it doesn't matter which race or which political belief they had. They're people, and among them are civilians who got caught up in this, perhaps intentionally, perhaps inadvertently. There are children's bodies, not just in the north, in the south as well.
That's right.
So I think perhaps the time has come, or we're getting close to the time when we need to have a process for this, and it shouldn't be a very complicated political process. Right, now let's get to legal reform. Another key area. We have seen some, we got the Proceeds of Crime Act and so on.
Yes.
So there is definitely progress. And the Minister of Justice a few weeks ago on this show said that the PTA is going out. The Prevention of Terrorism Act is going out.
Yes.
A committee is going to look into what act needs to come to replace the PTA, because we do need something which will deal with terrorism, and of course the Online Safety Act, which somehow seems to have flown beneath the radar.
That's right. Well, I wouldn't say it's flown beneath the radar, because it was the only law that was actually referred to by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Who was here last week?
Where he called for the repeal of the law. When he came to the PTA, he called for a moratorium, because there is a commitment to repeal the PTA. But on the Online Safety Act, he very much called for the immediate repeal of the Online Safety Act. And I'm inclined to agree with him. The reason being that the Online Safety Act came at a time when the people had struggled against the government of the time. There was what we call the Aragalaya. And then that Aragalaya featured a lot of criticism of that leadership, political leadership, including a lot of the members of parliament. And there was a demand by MPs that some new law is brought in to curb this criticism, particularly online. And it was that demand was quite rampant. And the government at the time, that was already weakened, already in a precarious situation, decided to appease these political voices by bringing this law and giving them the tools to start pushing back on people who are criticizing them on social media. That was the political motivation behind the Online Safety Act. So it is a politically motivated act.
Well, it's
Although it
never good to have politically motivated laws.
I agree.
Or temporary laws which last for decades, like the PTA.
Which is what the PTA is. So it was fundamentally a politically motivated act. It was touted as an act that was there to protect women and children from online abuse, but the National Child Protection Authority wasn't even properly consulted on it. So we know that it was a politically motivated act, and we know the history of this act. So when the people demand for something different, a break from the past, a move away from this politicization of the law, I think the Online Safety Act is a symbol that really has to be rooted out. There is no compromise here. There is no situation in which the Online Safety Act can be reformed, because it stands for something that the people of the country have come forward and voted against. So if you continue to leave the Online Safety Act on our statute books, you're basically saying that we will continue with the politicization of the law, which I don't think the government wants to do. I think it makes common sense, and perhaps it is just a sensible choice to repeal this act. And if you want to have a law that deals with online safety, start from the beginning and consult the right experts. Make sure that if it is about children, certainly bring in the National Child Protection Authority into the mix, consult the Human Rights Commission, consult digital experts. There's a process that you can begin with. The Online Safety Act did all of these things completely wrong, and then was rushed in as an act of parliament. Even the Supreme Court's determination that listed out so many problems with the act and required it to be amended if it was to be passed with a simple majority was not followed. In fact, the Commission wrote to the Speaker of the time and raised the question, has Parliament really passed this law? Because if these amendments are not brought in, the amendments required by the Supreme Court in totality, then this act required a 2/3 majority. That's what the Constitution says. Right. You either pass it with a simple majority with all the amendments recommended, or you pass it with a 2/3 majority without those recommendations. And there were at least 10 or 12 recommendations of the Supreme Court that had been missed, which means the act didn't get the requisite number of votes. It required a special majority and didn't get it.
So when you say missed, I mean, that was quite intentionally done. We are not talking about 5-year-olds in a kindergarten here. It was deliberately done. Which is contempt of the Supreme Court.
I'm inclined to agree with you. So that is the legacy of this law. So I know that the reform of the PTA is not an easy thing to do, and the government has committed to reforming the law on terrorism. The Human Rights Commission's position is that offense on terrorism can be brought into the penal code, and the procedure to be followed when investigating such an offense should be the regular law. The reason we say this is law enforcement authorities should not get a choice on what legal procedural regime to apply. If you commit an offense, say for example, you go and steal a bicycle and you are who you are, the police may decide to use the regular legal procedure to investigate your offense. But say another individual does the same act but comes from a different community, and because of that racial and religious profile, the police decide, oh, this person may have stolen a bike to commit an act of terrorism, so we're going to apply the terrorism procedure. The two of you will experience the law completely differently by virtue of just the choice of the police officer, which is why the Human Rights Commission is of the view that the procedural regime should be the same regardless of who the person is. The only way to guarantee that is to make sure that the law dictates that procedure has to be the same for everyone. Because you're innocent until proven guilty. If both of these individuals come out of the experience and are both acquitted, one has gone through regular law and has got bail and basically stood trial and then was eventually acquitted. The other one has gone through detention, possibly torture, and then finally comes out of that process 16 years later, like that case, that very famous PTA case, 16 years later only to be acquitted. So
Right.
then do we really want a special law on the PTA? But leave aside the PTA. PTA is difficult. The Online Safety Act is, in very simple terms, a no-brainer. It is a politicized law with a political legacy that can easily be rooted out, because this government is not responsible for the law. None of its supporters supported this law. It is a relic of a past political culture that we feel and we recognize has now been rejected.
Right.
So the Online Safety Act is a litmus test as to whether the government really wants to break from that past.
Absolutely. And I would also put it to you that these acts are symbolic to the public, to the nation,
That's right.
of oppression, which, you know, we believe we have done our best to break away from. So if you still, you have a new government and all the apparatus and it's moving forward, fine. But if you still have these odious symbols, the OSA, the PTA, you know, certain other laws like the criminalization of homosexuality and so on, if you still have all those, then the country at large, and of course certain particular communities which were hard hit by these acts, will not feel free.
That's right. So I think it is very important that the right signal is sent out. And particularly when the UN chief on human rights has decided to look at this issue and issue such a strong condemnation of a law, it seems like there's really a very easy way out here, and that is to repeal the Online Safety Act and then begin a genuine process through which online safety can be prioritized through a new law. And that I think people will support. Because if you look at the people who are making complaints under the Online Safety Act today, a vast majority of those cases are political actors who are trying to suppress criticism of their activities, rightly or wrongly. A lot of the criticism might be unfair. But hey, when you take public office, you are criticized. That's part of the job. You need to have a thick skin about that. When every time the Human Rights Commission is criticized, I mean, if we run to the magistrate court and try to get orders preventing that, do we really stand for the freedom of expression? No, we don't. So we need to be able to absorb and take that pressure and not overreact. But giving this law as an option to many of the political actors, they are exercising that option. So a vast majority of these cases are actually filed by political actors, and they are hiring lawyers to go and then find a magistrate that would issue a conditional order, and often under the law you can get a conditional order. So it just creates a perverse incentive to suppress the freedom of expression, and I don't think the public
this is a litmus test for the government.
This is indeed a litmus test.
Right, and I'm afraid we are out of time. Gehan, it's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much for coming down. My thanks to Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, one of the commissioners of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, and an attorney at law, of course. And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.